and I am delighted to present today our report on co-investment and infrastructure sharing. This is a report on infrastructure sharing in the fixed and mobile markets with a focus on the implementation aspects of such deals. So the presentation today will be organized as follows. I will start by giving some background on our report, explain the research questions that we decided to investigate and the approach that we have adopted in this project. I will then discuss the pros and cons of infrastructure sharing. And then Steffen and I will discuss the implementation aspects of sharing agreements. And finally, Steffen and Winston will present the main lessons that we draw from the analysis of country cases and case law. So network sharing for mobile is widely used in Europe today. Co-investment for fixed networks also exists in a number of countries. And as Bruno reminded us, it is a key element of the new code for electronic communications. So in both cases, this type of arrangement is seen as a way to stimulate investment in network coverage and upgrade. So in this report, what we did was to define co-investment as sharing for fixed networks and network sharing as sharing for mobile networks, and infrastructure sharing includes either co-investment or network sharing. So this is the definition that we will use in this presentation today. So from a policy perspective, there are trade-offs associated with infrastructure sharing. So on the one hand, it is seen as a way to stimulate investment, but there is also concerns about infrastructure sharing, in particular, possibilities that it may, under certain circumstances, harm competition. So in this report, what we decided to do was to focus on the implementation aspects of infrastructure sharing, and we try to answer the following question of whether there are some implementation aspects or some aspects of these deals that can be designed in such a way to maximize the benefits of sharing while minimizing the potential costs. So in this report, what we do is to propose a generic approach that aims at including sharing for both fixed and mobile networks in fixed and mobile markets. And we also highlight, of course, the differences that exist between fixed and mobile when it is relevant, and in particular for the type of investment that is involved. So our analysis and our conclusions are based on an economic analysis of infrastructure sharing and its impact on market outcomes. We used for that the relevant economic literature, so some of our own research, in particular with Steffen, and also the work from others. And we also drew lessons by looking at the experience of 12 European countries for infrastructure sharing, and by reviewing also relevant legal cases. So let me start by discussing the pros and cons of sharing. So using an economic analysis, what we concluded is that infrastructure sharing has strong benefits in terms of stimulating competition in services between firms and stimulating investment either for increased coverage or upgrades. So these benefits of infrastructure sharing are obtained with respect to a counterfactual situation without sharing. And in the fixed markets, we could argue that when it concerns SMP operators, this counterfactual situation would imply access obligations. But this would not be the case typically with non-SMP operators, where we would argue that there would be no access and most likely one operator only available to the consumers. So in both cases, we argue that sharing leads to increased network coverage and more intense competition to the benefit of consumers. For mobile, in the absence of sharing, there would be no access obligations, typically, and competition between 3 or 4 nationwide mobile networks, as it exists in most countries in Europe today. And these operators would invest independently to upgrade their networks. So again, this benchmark, again, what we argue is that sharing leads to increased quality and more intense competition in the marketplace, in the downstream market. So the drawbacks of infrastructure sharing are mainly due to potential anti-competitive effects. And we can distinguish between unilateral effects and coordinated effects. So, for example, a unilateral effect of sharing agreement would be this possibility that the partners may have the ability and the incentive to raise the access prices internally or externally to soften competition in the downstream market. Also, the agreement may have the property that it limits the partner's ability to act independently, to compete independently, for example, in terms of service innovation or independent investment. Or partners may have the ability through the design of the agreement to foreclose potential competitors from using their network. Secondly, the sharing agreements may have also the problem may entail a problem in terms of coordinated effects with risks of explicit or tacit collusion between the partners at the downstream level. So the competitive constraints from non-sharing operators can mitigate to some extent those effects, but we also argue that a proper design of the agreement can address these concerns. And this is why we looked in this research at the efficient implementation of sharing agreements with a view of trying to maximize benefits in terms of enhanced competition and investment while minimizing potential cost in terms of potential harm to competition. And we discussed in particular the following aspects of the implementation of sharing agreements: the operational model that is adopted by the partners, whether infrastructure sharing agreements should be regulated in some way, the interplay with other regulatory provisions, how late co-investment should be priced, and finally, sharing with business users. So let me start with the first aspect, the operational model. So we observe today in Europe 3 main operational models for infrastructure sharing: joint ventures, reciprocal access, and one-way sharing. So the trade-offs for firms between these models can be thought as a trade-off between 2 main kinds of agreements, or arrangements between firms. So cooperative arrangements and contractual arrangements. So cooperative arrangements typically take the form of joint ventures between the operators. The contractual arrangements include reciprocal access deals or one-way sharing deals between operators. So in this report, we highlight different trade-offs between for the firm between these cooperative arrangements on the one hand and contractual arrangements on the other hand. And in particular, so what we argue is that there is one trade-off in terms of complementarities and synergies, which tend to benefit joint ventures, and lower transaction costs, which tend to favor contractual arrangements. This is because with joint ventures, partners bring their own strengths, which can give rise to synergies or complementarities between partners. The downside is that running, forming, or terminating a joint venture is probably very costly in terms of transaction costs for the partners. And this is the benefits of more light arrangements like contractual arrangements for the partners. Another trade-off involves a choice between commitment and flexibility. A joint venture will typically imply strong commitment between the partners, which has some benefits in terms of alignment of interest or reduced opportunism between partners. On the other hand, in some cases, in particular, when market is very dynamic, there might be benefit with flexibility, which is brought by the contractual arrangements like reciprocal access or one-way sharing. So for society, there are also trade-offs, but what we argue is that what matters most in the end is a market context and the specific design of the agreement. So first, competitive constraints from outsider can mitigate the potential concerns associated with infrastructure sharing, but also what we argue is that the proper design of the agreement is a key element of such deals. And therefore, what we did in the report and this research was to propose a checklist for an efficient design of sharing agreements. So this is a checklist. It includes 6 design rules which aim to mitigate the anti-competitive effects of sharing deals in terms of unilateral or coordinated effects. So I'm not going to go through the whole list for the sake of time, but you can find it in the report that was published today. So I'm now giving the floor to Steffen to present the other implementation aspects.
Okay, thank you very much, Marc. So let me continue our implementation aspects. So the next issue is to look at regulation of network sharing. And here we have 2 aspects. Marc, can you scroll down? Okay, so the first aspect is, do we need regulation to create network sharing in the first place? And here we looked at the issues involved. The second topic here is, once we have proposals for network sharing, which may come up voluntarily, should these be regulated? Should be there any kind of intervention? And as we've seen with what Marc just presented, so it makes sense to have these agreements checked ex ante for their design and repair any issues that may arise. Next slide, please. Another important issue is that, of course, co-investment doesn't exist on its own. So usually there are other regulatory provisions in force which interact with any co-investment proposals. Marc, can you scroll down, please? So one type of regulation that usually is imposed on operators with significant market power is access regulations. Bruno already mentioned in the beginning that proposal by the new framework is to actually, so to speak, exchange access obligations for co-investment agreements. But so one issue important here would be to see what happens if access obligations are not lifted. These function as substitutes to infrastructure sharing, so reduce the incentives to enter those agreements in the first place. There are other types of regulation which are complements in the sense that they actually help to make those agreements more viable and more beneficial. Next slide. Okay, the next issue that we've looked at is an issue that is particularly important if co-investment provisions are imposed, as for example in France. Here the rules are that someone who invests will have to accept later co-investors. And here the issue is one of timing and uncertainty in the market. And so the potential later co-investors, they can simply wait and cherry pick where they want to invest. And this can actually cause a waiting game in the sense that everybody will invest later, even the first investment. And that, of course, we want to avoid. And therefore, what we've discussed here in the report based on research that we did is how we can set the rules and pricing for a later co-investment to actually avoid that this happens, so that first investment happens quickly and that the potential co-investors have the incentives to enter at the right time. Okay, next slide. Another important issue which would actually deserve a full report on its own to be thought through, and we've just touched on very quickly here, is the fact that there's a whole world out there of potential partners for sharing networks, which are not actually telecoms companies, but firms which provide content or use content such as e-mobility, health providers, and so on. As I said, this is something that is a bit outside the core of our report, but definitely worth to be thought about. There are some examples already between, say, industrial and ports and universities that have their campus networks which are shared in a sense with either mobile operators or network equipment vendors, but then it's just one party that actually invests in the network while the other one uses it. Another issue here is that we have in some countries spectrum reserved for this for business users, and so this is something that needs to be thought about in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so we looked at a dozen country cases. These countries, they were chosen because they each have some particularity which makes it interesting to look at. And as we will see, the lessons that we have on the next slides, they are very general. You really need to have to go through the list of the countries that we have to see all the details, and I have no time here to present those. So concerning mobile networks, and the main issues here is should there be passive sharing, that is passive infrastructure, or active sharing, that is the radio network, or even more. For example, sharing of spectrum or the core network. And what we usually have is that passive sharing is usually considered to be non-problematic, and quite often is even mandatory. The other opposite, spectrum core network sharing, usually is considered to give too little flexibility and independence to operators, but it does exist in some countries. And then the real contention here is about active sharing, how to design active sharing agreements to actually realize the synergies, but deal with the competition concerns. The general conclusion from all of this, as we look at different cases, thanks, Marc, is that in the mobile market, network sharing is associated with faster rollout, improved coverage. This is so the idea that people have, but this is also what they found when they looked at it afterwards. And even very intensive forms of sharing, they can be beneficial if design concerns are addressed. Okay, thanks, Marc. Next slide. With co-investment, there are essentially, we have to look at two different worlds here. One is actually a regulation that promotes co-investment. The French model has been in force for years. Now, as I said, investment must accept co-investment, and there's some experience with this, which we mentioned in the report. The new framework, we're still in the phase where this is put into practice, and we hope that maybe the report helps. Market-driven co-investments, there are quite a few of them, and most have been successful, some not. Usually depends on whether operators have the same strategic objectives over the time of the agreement. So generally, this works well. It's is associated with increased coverage. And thank you.
Okay, this is Winston. I hope you can hear me. I unmuted. Just a small summary of the lessons from the legal cases. The competition law cases on mobile network sharing go back over a decade. The first ones are from 2003. And basically the lessons from those cases are that sharing passive infrastructure like towers, masts, power supply are now well accepted. They're not viewed as restricting competition. There is quite a bit of focus, however, on whether site sharing will reduce the opportunity for third-party operators to have access to sites, either because the sites will be consolidated and therefore there will be a fewer number of sites for third-party operators to access, or the available space on the sites will be reduced because they'll all be used by the partners. Or, of course, the commercial conditions offered to third-party operators will be unfavorable. So that's really the focus of competition authorities. If we move to radio access network sharing, RAN sharing, that's quite a bit more complex because sharing active elements of the radio access network gives rise to some alignment in the technology and in the strategies of the parties, and those can have negative competitive effects. So there's quite a bit of focus by competition authorities on whether the RAN sharing will somehow diminish each party's individual incentive to upgrade its own network capacity. And in that respect, the overall competitive conditions in the country are the prime focus. You know, how many other mobile operators are there? What are the competitive drivers? And one of the key questions is, for example, are the competitive conditions really set in the urban markets? And if RAN sharing is just limited to the rural or not urban areas, perhaps the RAN sharing will not adversely affect competition because the competitive pressure will come from the urban markets. RAN sharing also raises issues on information exchange because in some cases you need to give traffic forecasts to the other party, and that can be problematic. So competition authorities focus on that quite a bit. But in RAN sharing, the key takeaway is the geographic scope needs to be limited to make sure that the competitive pressures aren't dampened in terms of network upgrades. Each party needs to be stimulated to upgrade its own network to increase capacity. National roaming, there's quite a bit of case law on national roaming. It's generally viewed as restricting competition, but it can be exempted for limited periods of time, particularly for rural areas, of course. Let's go to the fixed network lessons. For fiber co-investment, there's not quite so much case law. The Swiss were actually among the first. In 2011 and 2012, the Swiss Competition Authority examined fiber co-investment deals between Swisscom and regional energy companies. The other cases date from 2017, 18, and 19, so they're much more recent. The key focus here is to compare as Marc said at the beginning, to compare the cooperation situation with the counterfactual and ask the question, will the co-investment increase the network rollout and make it faster than it would be in the case of no cooperation? And in that respect, the competition authorities will not just look at what the agreement says or what the official commitments are. They will actually ask the question, are these rollout commitments, are they credible and enforceable? In particular, if it looks like one of the parties may not have the right incentives to respect the rollout calendar, competition authorities will be quite skeptical and may insist that there be more enforceable deadlines. The other focus, of course, like for mobile, is whether the cooperation will restrict the ability of other third-party operators to access the market. So in that case, there will be a lot of focus on what wholesale products are available, including fiber wholesale products, IRUs, existence of several fibers, if there's a bitstream offer, and there may be a requirement that the joint venture or the cooperation offer non-discriminatory access to wholesale inputs. Since we're talking about wholesale inputs, another aspect will be to make sure, this was a focus of the Swiss authorities as well, to make sure that the pricing of wholesale inputs doesn't bake in monopoly rents that are hidden. For example, if one of the parties provides access to ducts or maintenance services, to make sure that those prices are cost-oriented. And the reason for that, there are two reasons for that. One is so that doesn't artificially increase the prices on the downstream market, leading to price coordination between the two partners. But also, will that increase the price of those wholesale products to third parties? And then as for mobile infrastructure sharing, there's always the question of whether information exchange goes beyond what is strictly necessary.